And the topic today is why leading globally matters for the Heartland. We are honored to partner up with U.S. Global Leadership Coalition to make this public discussion available. And my name is Min Fan. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. Heartland China Association. Before we get started, I have two housekeeping items. First of all, throughout the event, feel free to submit questions through the Q&A option. We did get a lot of questions before the event from the registrants, so we'll try to address as many as possible. Our panelists also have organized their answers, comments around some of the questions submitted as well. And finally, at the end of the event, when you leave, there's a very quick survey that will pop up. Please take a minute or even less than that to let us know what you think. We really appreciate your feedback. So with that, I would like to welcome our first panelist, Liz Schrayer. Liz serves as the President and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, often known as USGLC, which is a broad-based coalition of businesses, nonprofit, and community leaders from around the country working to strengthen America's role in the world. Under her leadership, the coalition, now in its 25th year, has grown into a network of advocates in all 50 states. And we will be hearing more from her shortly on the work USGLC is doing. Liz is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and currently serves on USAID's Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid, as well as several advisory boards for the University of Michigan, where she earned her bachelor's degree. The USGLC and the U.S. Heartland China Association have partnered together for a long time, and we are honored to have Liz join us today. And next we have with us today is Ward Klein. Ward has held many senior leadership roles throughout his accomplished career. He's often known for his role as the CEO of Energizer Holdings from 2005 to 2015. And he also served as chairman of the board for the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and as well as many, many other board positions for civic organizations and nonprofits. Mr. Klein obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics from St. Olaf College in Minnesota and a master's in management from Kellogg Graduate School of Management at Northwestern University. And to host them and moderate discussion will be our very own Chairman CEO, Bob Holden, and Governor Missouri from 2001 to 2005. With that, I'm going to turn to Governor Holden and our panelists and for your discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Min, and delighted to have everybody with us today. I couldn't be more excited that the panelists that we have. I've got to know Liz for the last few years, being involved with her organization, and there's probably no one more dynamic and forward-thinking than Liz. And so I really appreciate, Liz, all of your leadership for the organization and for our country at large. So delighted to be with you. And of course, I'm going to be very interested in hearing from Ward so he can give us some answers to some of the economic issues that we're trying to deal with as a country. But I'll start off by asking Liz if she would to please kind of tell our audience about the organization and the global leadership that they're involved with and who they're involved with and their vision and where they go from here. And what we need to be doing to strengthen our involvement with the organization, particularly at a time we're dealing with COVID-19 and the pandemic and what's going on around the world. And so, Liz, delighted to be in your presence again, even though we're not together in person.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Min, for the introduction, your fantastic work. And Governor Holden, I'd come visit you anywhere, even if it's virtually. I'm so honored to be joining the U.S. Heartland China Association and thrilled to be with everybody this morning and look forward, Ward, to sharing the platform with you. And truthfully, I am sorry I'm not with you in person because as you know, Governor, I grew up in the Heartland. I think it's the best part of the country. I live in Washington, D.C., and they think they're the center of the world, but the truth is the Heartland is, and I know it and we all know it. I want to give you a shout out right back. I've gotten to know you, and are an extraordinary leader, not only with the U.S. Heartland China Association. You co-chair our advisory committee in Missouri, and I have watched you do so many things about impacting the citizens of your great state, but with me, you know, being hand in hand of speaking out about why America's role in the world is so important. So thank you for the invite. Your question. You know, the synergy that we're going to talk about this morning between the U.S. Heartland China Association and the USGLC is really striking, as I think about a lot what I've been thinking about the last 5 months. We hit our, as Min said, our 25th birthday this year. So I think a lot about America's role in the world right now as we all are sitting in our homes and what that means, because we were formed 25 years ago, and everybody should think back of what was happening 25 years ago, and it was the end of the Cold War, was dying down, and a lot of our fellow citizens thought, we won. So we don't need all these tools that we use to be engaged in the world, and we could pull back. And there was this desire to say, we don't need the tools like the State Department, our Peace Corps, USAID, the tools of civil engagement that brought us to winning that war. And it was so dangerous. And I actually remember members of the House of Representatives that bragged that they didn't own a passport. And all I have to say is, you know, 9/11, and we can, global pandemic, and we can think of all these things that have since happened that are so dangerous. So fast forward, we built a big tent coalition. Washington Post calls us the Strange Bedfellow Coalition, to really speak out about why we need to be engaged. So thank goodness you're involved, but what we are is a big coalition of 500 businesses and NGOs that normally don't join arm in arm together. We're bipartisan and proud of that. We have every former living Secretary of State, as an example, on our advisory committee. We bring together military leaders, over 200 retired 3- and 4-star generals. We live in every state. And what kind of brings us together, and I know we're going to talk about it this morning with Ward, is that America needs to be engaged in the world, because what happens globally really matters locally, the name of this conversation, because it matters to our values, it matters to our security, and it really matters to our economy. And that's what this association is all about. So we advocate for the importance of development and diplomacy alongside our military. In Washington, it's known as the little 1% of our federal budget, called the International Affairs budget. Everybody thinks it's just foreign aid, but it's so much more of that. It's our diplomats that are out there all around the world. It's the aid workers in West Africa that stopped Ebola, and we'll talk about the global pandemic that's going on now. And it's programs that really open up the markets for our goods and services. And we'll talk about the Heartland and how important is it, but I want to end with talking about your last part is how has COVID impacted our work? And we'll talk about it more, but just to give you a kind of headline, you can't stop a global pandemic without a global response. And so it is dramatically impacting our work and kind of putting it on steroids as the world is just as impacted, as we know, in places like Latin America and Africa, as just one example, as 2 examples. And so we're really focused on how we need to make sure that there is a global response. For example, in the supplementals that are being negotiated right now in Congress. So in the long run, what we need to make sure is that we as a country have the political will, that we are never as unprepared and frankly underfunded as we were for this global pandemic. CDC says 70% of the world have health systems that are unprepared to detect and prevent any kind of pandemic. So what we do is, I spend usually most of my time traveling around the country, normally in places like in the Heartland, places like Kalamazoo and your backyard, hosting conversations about why it's important to engage in in a health system in places that most of us never travel to. And that's really important. And I hope we get into this in part of the conversation about why leading globally really matters locally. And what we found is members of Congress really do get it, and their constituents really do get it. And what we do is try to bring those two conversations together.
Liz, I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate your focus on what I call the heartland of this country. And what most people don't realize, you look at the leadership that our country has projected since 1945 on. So many of these presidents, vice presidents, secretaries of this, secretaries of that, have all come out of this region of the country. So I think it's very, very kind of you to really pick this up and lead on it. And one of our prize individuals is Warren this morning. I mean, his background working with different presidents, Energizer Corporation. He was CEO there, Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis. Is people like Ward have to help us figure out how we get back up and running after all of our COVID-19 and the politics, the international politics we've been dealing with over the last several years. So, Ward, give us some good advice and good sense of direction, because I think our region and our country need it very badly right now.
Well, thank you, Governor. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for including me in this conversation, and especially thank you for the efforts your organizations are doing to improve global interdependence. And really, the U.S. is in a position to exert global leadership unlike any other country, or has been. Virtually since World War II. At times we relinquished that. I think these past 3 years we have been relinquishing that. But whether it's language, whether it's technology, whether it's our open systems of democracy, we still are viewed as a leader. But we do take hits at times. I think our handling of this pandemic is an example of that. And the lack of leadership as a country in dealing with this once-in-a-lifetime event is an unfortunate example, and it is setting us back. And in terms of leading the world out of the pandemic, I think we've proven our inability to do that. And it's a struggle that U.S. companies and the U.S. people unfortunately have to carry until either herd immunity kicks in, heaven forbid, or some sort of vaccine is developed, and that's the hope. But stepping back over my decades of doing international business, I have been amazed at how U.S. multinationals in particular have been able to cope with the ups and downs that we've gone through as a leader and in our relationships with other countries. And I'm optimistic that from a U.S. multinational point of view and a U.S. economic point of view, we will come out of this and remain strong and try to remain the leader of the world. But you have to act a leader to be a leader. And until we have some leadership in Washington to help us in that regard, multinationals are feeling like they're kind of on their own right now. And that's sometimes fighting with one hand tied behind your back against very capable international competitors in business, especially out of China, especially out of Asia, is not helpful for our economy. It's not helpful for the global economy. So hopefully we can get that hand untied that's behind our back right now.
Well, I appreciate both of you really focusing on the bipartisanship that we need to have to try to figure out how to solve the issues that face our country and the world. And Liz, you fill us in a little bit more about what we need to be doing globally to respond to the COVID-19 situation, and how we can really exert our leadership to help the world.
So I'm with Ward on this one, is that, as I said earlier, I don't know how you address the global pandemic without a global response. I was quite concerned when there's a international vaccine conference and America doesn't show up. So one of the things that we've been working and focused on is, as everyone I believe knows, there have been these big emergency supplemental bills that have been being negotiated over the last few months in Washington. So far, there have been 3 trillions of dollars rightfully focused on how we address both the health and the economic recovery of this nation. To date, there have been 3 bills. We have invested approximately on the international side the exact amount that we invested to respond to Ebola in 3 countries. Now absorb that. 0.1% of the entire $1 trillion have gone to an international response that is affecting the world. So that means both from a humanitarian point of view, how we want to address our fellow citizens, but also from our domestic recovery. If we got everything right, which we're clearly not in this country, we first plane out and first plane back, this is coming back to our own shores. So we are focused on this bill that's being negotiated right now. And we believe that there are resources needed if we even pull the humanitarian piece out and just deal with the domestic recovery, that we need to deal with the global health programs before and after vaccine is created and get ready for that. I already gave you the statistic about how weak and health health systems are around the world. We have to deal with international, economic, and humanitarian issues that are facing, as well as frontline operations for our own personnel overseas. So we are calling for $20 billion. We think at the end of the day, who knows what will actually happen in this bill, but that could be about 1% of the likely bill. On the humanitarian front, there are countries like, take Madagascar, 30 million citizens, they have 50 ventilators total. Sierra Leone, 7.5 million people, they have 18 ventilators. So that's the humanitarian side. One last point that I think Ward will appreciate, and I'm sure he has something to say about it. Economically, in the Heartland, you all know the incredible impact that exports have overseas. In the emerging markets, these are critical to our economic recovery. Exports are just dropping in the emerging markets. In the last year, exports to places like South Africa are down 40%. In Brazil, they're down 40%. In India, they're down 60%. So if we don't put some investments in the international side of making sure that these countries have some response, we are only hurting ourselves. So what we're doing is trying to make sure there is an international response that's going to be part of our domestic recovery. And the last thing I would say, Governor, is, are we going to get to a bill? Right now, we are, you've probably been watching the news, bipartisanship from when you were governor, it is really different in Washington. They are just at different, we are talking past each other. We are not talking with each other. The good news is they are talking. The bad news is we are not close to a deal yet.
That's too bad, because I think we've already passed the point of when this deal was supposed to be done. Ward, what is your thoughts on the relief packages, and which ones should we look at, think about, and hope see some action done on Congress?
You know, I'm putting my kind of economics major hat on. The $3 trillion that have already been passed and spent is breathtaking, really, as a fiscal response. And if there was any time that was justified, I do think this pandemic was it. My biggest regret is I feel like we as a nation, as a people, have made an investment. Have borrowed $3 trillion and have made an investment in ourselves and have squandered that investment by allowing this pandemic to reign. Instead of doing the right things up front in March and April and taking this money when we shut the economy down and supporting all those entities that are suffering as a result, we had very little to show for that investment. And I find that as a sobering economic comment. And do we need more? Yes, Liz, I agree with you. We do need more because we haven't we haven't addressed the problem, but we've invested a tremendous amount. The $3 trillion, and it's amazing, we talk in trillions now. Back during the financial crisis when I was on the Federal Reserve in 08, 09, $800 billion was the amount spent, as I recall, or thereabouts. And that was a breathtaking amount under which, at that time, the administration got tremendous criticism of. And now we're talking a multiple of that. The $800 billion spent in 08, 09, I think, was well spent and kept us from having Depression 2.0. The $3 trillion, as I've cited, I think has been somewhat squandered. It was necessary, but we're not showing the result. And so we need to continue to spend. But last comment is just from an economic point of view, it makes me nervous to know that we're loading this amount of debt onto the backs of our children and grandchildren as we go forward as a country. And as you think of the long game of the U.S. being a competitive leader in the world, we are burdening ourselves with an enormous amount of debt at this point in time that will have to be paid back at some point. And those resources that are diverted towards paying back that debt are resources that could have been used on something else. Is it manageable? Yes. And no one seems to be worried about the debt level right now. It makes me a little nervous that no one's even talking about it. And we have to spend the money we are. I wish we were spending it more effectively. I wish we had the results to show for it better than what we have right now.
You know, Governor, I'd add one thing that's an interesting dynamic in terms of when and if this, I do think that a package will get passed because it's election year and too many members need it to get passed. But apparently there are upwards towards 20 Republicans in the Senate that are saying what Ward is referring to, which is they don't want any more money to be passed. I think they eventually will vote on something. But part of the equation is how much money they are willing to keep voting on. And these are the fiscal conservatives that are saying enough is enough. And so there is not a consistent voice within the Republican Party about how much money, more money, they're willing to vote for. So that's one of the equations that is going on, this political pull and tug about how much more debt we're willing to take on. I don't think it's a big enough pull. Eventually this is going to get passed.
And I would agree too. I do think an additional bill is warranted. I hope it's highly targeted. I think targeting it towards the unemployed right now makes the most sense. I think just cutting $1,200 checks for anybody, regardless of their employment situation or basically income level under 150, maybe makes less sense. But the unemployment, and no fault on their own, are facing an awful environment as we go forward with this pandemic still raging.
I would ask Liz and Ward too, maybe, you know, if you look back at our history when President Truman was in office and then Eisenhower, they looked outward. They saw what had happened with World War II and World War I and the disintegration of cooperative relationships. And they really made an effort to try to figure out how we could engage ourselves globally around the world and be a partner. And now I see so much of what they have done from both political parties being dismantled. And how do we get the message across to the citizens of our country that it's important that we have these relationships around the world?
You know, it's really interesting. So we've done some polling to see where the heartbeat of America is on these very questions, and then I'll talk about where the policymakers are. And we do this relatively often to see it. COVID moved the country. This won't probably surprise you, but I was surprised the extent it moved the country. Literally 30 points on the following question. Do you support investing in countries with weak and fragile health systems so that it will help keep Americans safe? 30 points in 1 year. Now, obviously, you know, we're self-interest. When I have polled over the years, infectious diseases are probably the thing that moves people faster than anything because We get that. Nobody wants a plane to come over and make us sick. And so that moves people, and people immediately get it. Now, as soon as there's a vaccine, we'll go back to being less concerned about it. And so I know right now, the American public really get, we better be connected in the world. Now, there is a disconnect with some of our politicians about that connection. We right now, America, are not part of the international conversation about how to distribute the vaccine once it is found, once there is a vaccine. There is a nativism going on with lots of countries about the vaccine distribution, which even again, if you remove the humanitarian equation of it, I would argue is just not smart from a self-interest point of view. So I think, though, that is not everybody. That is a part of this country. It's not everybody. I think there is a big debate going on, and I think that is going to be part of the national debate that's going to go on, is which direction we want to go. And whatever happens on November 3rd or 10th or December, whatever we know what's going to happen on the presidential front, I do think that there has always been, since the founding of the United States, a portion of this country that is what we would all call protectionist, nativist, isolationist, pick your term. And there's always been a portion of this country that is the Ben Franklin internationalists. But there's a middle part of the country today that says, of course we need to be engaged in the world, but help us make sure that we understand what's the return on investment for us. And that's what U.S. Heartland China Association is about, and that's what U.S. Global Leadership Coalition is about how do we make that case of what is the return on investment of why we need to be engaged in the world.
You know, that's very interesting, Liz and Ward. Part of that investment and focus has been centered around the rise of China and the building of relationships between the United States and China. Explain to all of us the importance of China and its value, and how do we find some common ground to be able to work together in the future on?
I guess I could take a crack at that. You know, the one thing that's different now than historically is China's number 2 in the world and closing the gap with the U.S. This is a different dynamic than we have as a nation experienced the previous 200 years. It can be either a good dynamic or a bad. I think your organizations and others are trying to make it a good dynamic, and I think that's the right side to fall on. It's challenging from a political point of view. It's challenging from a values point of view. There are different value sets between the two countries, and so how you recognize that, understand that, and still find constructive ways to engage is the challenge before government, NGOs, and multinationals, the peoples of those two countries. There are, at times when that relationship has worked very, very well. The opening up of China and really the times I was in Hong Kong and managing Asian operations, there was a very good symbiotic relationship between the needs of China in terms of moving forward, lowering poverty levels, employment, and needs for U.S. multinationals in terms of labor pools, technology, infrastructure. It was very compatible back in 2000. And it still is to different degrees, different ways now. But we're entering a different phase. And so how do we as the US and how do the Chinese find a way to take what is a natural competition, but also aspects of collaboration, focus on the collaborative sides, and manage the competition in a healthy way? That's the challenge, really. And that's the challenge now, and that's the challenge going forward, folks. I mean, this is a different dynamic than we have grown up with. And we need to understand that and understand what it means for us as a people what it means to the Chinese people, and what it means to the world. And do we make it a healthy dynamic or an unhealthy one? In the past 3 years, I think we've found ways to make it more unhealthy than it needs to be. And the future leadership needs to find a way to restore the positive aspects of that relationship. That's, again, where your organizations come into play outside the government, multinational per se, in terms of laying the groundwork for that. And for that, I thank you.
Thank you. Liz, what's your feeling about how do we find common ground between our culture and our country and China's culture and their history and their country, so that we can continue to have a peaceful world that is successful for all inhabitants?
Well, thank goodness for the U.S. Heartland China Association. I can't get my head around this kind of one or the other, compete or cooperate. It's not an either or, as Ward said. I don't know how you solve a global pandemic without them, even if there are some very important needs to figure out what in the world happened back in December and January, and there's plenty of time to do it. The real challenge, we did this in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We found things to cooperate with them as well as battle with them. So the real challenge for me is taking a look at what they are doing in a series of areas, and then what we're doing, instead of just complaining about all the things that they're doing. So I've been watching very closely, for example, on the things that we look at. The Belt Road Initiative is assuming, now it's a little bit on hold, but 7 times that of the Marshall Plan. They've doubled their diplomacy budget. In COVID, they're out there providing 120 countries with PPE. In Africa alone, their investments have been 520% increase over 15 years. And I took a group of advisors to the president a year ago to Zambia. And these are people who were not so sure that they believed in what we were doing in Africa. We got off the plane, and the first thing they saw is a beautiful, you could go anywhere in Africa and pretty much see this. I think most of our audience probably knows this. But the first thing they saw is a beautiful glass airport made by China. And one of our guests, very high level person in the campaign, extremely high level person in the re-elect campaign, said, "Wow, China's eating our lunch." And I turned to him, I said, "Yeah, what are we doing about it?" So and we are doing something about it, but we're not doing enough. We were very involved in something called the Build Act, USGLC, which was to up our game on our development finance corporation. So what we're doing on development, but it's not enough. And the last thing I would say is I just hosted a town hall meeting. I think Governor Holden, you might have participated and watched, with Secretary Bob Gates, our former Secretary of Defense, for Democrats and Republicans. And his whole message is we as Americans need what he calls a symphony of power, tools of development and diplomacy, not just military. And he particularly calls out the China relationship, just what Ward said. And he says, they're using we've starved our non-military toolkit, and they are going to battle us, and most likely could beat us on the economic arena if we don't get in the game. So call them out on the Uyghurs, on human rights, absolutely, and fight them on the economics, but we have to stay on the playing field in a way. We're never going to, we're never going to win dollar for dollar, but we have to leverage our toolkit in a whole different way than I certainly think we have been doing. And we can talk, spend the whole day talking about this, but thank goodness that you're out there trying to build these relationships in a way that are really, really powerful and important.
Well, thank you. And I, to our audience, when they get the opportunity, buy Bob Gates' book, because it is very, very good. It'll keep you awake at night, unfortunately, at times with reading some of it, but it's worthwhile. And Ward, you've dealt in international finance for a long time. How do we find some common grounds with China, or how do we position ourselves so that we can be a co-equal in competition for the hearts and minds and souls of people around the world?
Really two different questions in the way I think about it. The first on just the collaboration and competition. I think, as much as our government can help us in terms of the enforcement of rule and law would be helpful. And that has been a big issue, certainly for international companies operating in China. I could share horror stories with you, but I won't, over the past. To level the playing field and let the respective multinationals and companies and organizations compete. I do believe competition is good in terms of, from a macroeconomic point of view, in terms of improving the human condition. I think the more you can focus on that level playing field from a business point of view, the better for all economically. I think in terms of the hearts and minds of the world, I still think the U.S. has a very strong advantage. I reflect back in the 70s and 80s, the term Yankee go home and take me with you. And that still is true. I think a lot of people in the third world, whether it's from Africa or Latin America or elsewhere, if they had a choice of immigrating to either the U.S. or China, I think we'd win that about 95% of the time, for those who would like to immigrate. Many don't want to, I understand that. But the point is, the open systems and democracy of this country remain our competitive advantage as it relates to how we're viewed, I think, relative to, in this specific case, China. And the Chinese money is the Belt and Road and the infrastructure investments that the Chinese make into Africa in particular and elsewhere are needed by those countries, are welcomed by those countries. They come with some strings attached, which some of these countries are finding out. We could do a better job of offering similar sort of investments as well. But from a cultural point of view, I think it remains a competitive advantage for the U.S. And we need to think of how we remain opening and welcoming to other people in other countries and all types. And it is our competitive advantage, and we've eroded that a little bit maybe the last 3 years.
Very, very important point. And Liz, how can your organization help us respond globally? Because I think what Ward is saying is right on point. Let's don't walk away and say we've lost the battle. Let's figure out how to win the battle and what tools we need to put in place to do that. And your organization, I think, is pivotal to getting that message across.
I think that my experience is the vast majority of policymakers really do resonate with exactly what Ward is talking about and what Governor Holden, you speak about all the time. But they need to hear from us as American citizens to say, we agree. We are a society we are a democracy, small d democracy, where that we need to speak up and speak out. And so what we want to encourage you to do is to speak out and say thank you to members of Congress and communicate to members of Congress that, number one, America should be engaged in the world. Number two is exactly on the issue of how we want America and China to engage, is call them out when they're not, it's not a productive relationship, when they are overreaching, whether it's human rights or their economic activities. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we expect it to be no cooperation whatsoever. So I'll give you an example on your question about COVID supplemental of what we would want to do. There was a really powerful letter that was sponsored by Senator Rubio and Senator Cardin, a bipartisan letter that the vast majority of the senators, Democrats and Republicans from the Heartland, signed on, that said, we believe that we need to have an international response to to this next supplemental. People like Kevin Kramer in North Dakota and to Sherrod Brown in Ohio that probably don't, this is a very conservative Republican and a very liberal Democrat, that probably don't agree on very much at all, but they both signed this letter and lots of others. Thank them. So my colleague JM is on this call, and he'll email out to Min a list of them to thank them. So these are the types of things that really do make a difference. Governor, you know, when you got communications from your constituents when you were in office, not just yelling at you, but actually appreciating when you do nice things, it makes a difference. So how can we work together? That's what I would say, is that we need to speak out, because I can tell you policymakers hear a lot about domestic issues. You know, when the street lamp goes out on the corner, they hear about that. But what happens overseas, we often talk about it around our homes and yell to our spouses, but we don't call and write our Congress people, and we need to.
Well, I appreciate that. Keep in mind, I was a governor from 2001 to 2005 and had to deal with the financial crisis. And when you try to raise taxes, that doesn't always make you the most popular person in the room. But I appreciate your comments. What, from Liz, your standpoint, what do you see your work as an organization working with the Heartland region? How can we do more? How can we be more productive in achieving your goals? Because USGLC is truly a global world as well as a national. But let's bring it home to the Heartland. What are you doing, and what do you think needs to be done further to help the Heartland more engage with what your organization is all about?
Well, I really appreciate that question. You know, after the 2016 election, where you know, there was, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, I think everybody was surprised that the Heartland, there were call them the Reagan Democrats, the Obama switched to Trump, switched to, you know, there was a surprise. People were surprised. And the truth is that Washington, D.C. wasn't listening very well to what too many people, again, I'm from that part of the country, call it flyover country. And I said, you know what? We USGLC better pay attention. And the economic power of the Heartland is wildly important. I mean, the Heartland, 700 billion of the Heartland GDP goes from exports, largely agriculture, but not only. Ward knows this better than all of us on this, our co-chair is Dan Glickman. Some of you probably know him. He's the former agriculture secretary from Kansas, Wichita, Kansas. And I talk to him all the time. He's a very dear friend of over 30 years about the nexus of the Heartland and global food security and our economy and exports. So we made a decision to go much deeper in a meaningful way into the Heartland. And we partnered with a number of people, but particularly Cargill, which is a 150-year-old company based in the Heartland, right outside of Minneapolis, to say, let's go on a listening tour and figure out what is Washington, D.C. missing? So I've spent the last 3.5 years in every place from Appleton, Wisconsin to Kalamazoo, Michigan. JM has gone on wheat tours in Kansas and Missouri, and I've been to Iowa and Fargo, North Dakota, Ohio, Pennsylvania. I could go on and on. We hired extra staff. And largely what we did is we hosted members of Congress in smaller communities with their constituents to talk about the exact title of this conversation today: why does leading globally matter locally? And I'll just tell you once, the very first one I did was in Appleton, Wisconsin, with their Congressman Michael Gallagher, who is a veteran from the Iraq and Afghanistan war. Young man, brilliant. And Appleton, Wisconsin was economically really crushed because they are the premier paper mill of this country. And a lot of the small business leaders showed up there, but they understand exports. and they understand that we better be engaged, just like we're talking about today, in the world. And what we are finding is there's this hunger to have a conversation about how we engage. And when more than half of the US exports are to the developing world, we better, and 2/3 of agriculture exports now go to the developing world, we better understand that, especially in COVID-19, when up to $9 trillion of the global economy could be wiped out because of COVID. So we're doubling down. The last point I'd make is this: we are doubling down in our Heartland tour, listening tour. We'll probably do it virtually, but with Cargill, with Dan Glickman, we're going to get into either even deeper conversations. We would love the people on this conversation to be part of it. We want to understand how food security and global health need to be internationally, need to be part of our economic recovery. And we're going to do that for the first 7 months of next year in small group conversations, about 25 people at a time, with mayors and governors, if they'll join us, state legislators and business leaders. And then we're going to conclude with a regional summit next fall to really see if we can help bring some thought leadership to Washington, D.C.
That's nice to hear. Good luck. Ward, let me ask you, being from our Heartland region, how would you put together a game plan, so to speak, and where the Heartland needs to focus on really getting the message across of just how valuable and important the Heartland is, not just to ourselves, but also to our country and to the world?
You know, I think in the Heartland, you have some different audiences. And certainly the agricultural community, the farmers in Iowa get it. They understand exports. They understand the importance of trade. You know, it's not just serendipity that in the trade war that's taken place these past 2 or 3 years, in this case, the Chinese went after our agricultural exports. They are massive, and massive for the Heartland. And no surprise to anybody listening in. The other two aspects of internationalism, though, that maybe people think of less of, that affect the Heartland, are number two would be the multinationals based here. So think of the Procter & Gambles, who are based in Ohio, who China is their number 2 or number 3 market in the world. Think of the 3Ms of the world. These are, again, Heartland-based multinationals, have nothing to do with agriculture, very much international players, very much global players. They get it. They understand the importance of what we're all talking about here in terms of good relations, level playing fields, economic prosperity for all. A third one, much lower maybe in materiality, but I would call out, is international students coming to Heartland universities, land-grant universities. It's not unique to the Heartland, obviously, none of these are. But this is a material contribution to our educational system, both in terms of economics to these institutions of higher learning, but also in terms of what they bring and what they take back from the Heartland of America to their own countries. So these are just 3 examples of the Heartland's understanding and focus on the world and on the international markets. But I preface my comment by there's different populations here. And you do have a large, less educated population. Populist rhetoric appeals to them. They are not engaged in those 3 areas I just cited, and they don't get it. They don't get it. And this is a challenge for our media, our education, our communications, our culture, to get that group. And it's a large group here. And again, not unique to the Heartland, but in the Heartland, who don't understand the importance of Africa, Latin America, and China as the enemy, because that's what they hear on certain media outlets, and that's what they tend to watch. That's our challenge. And I think it's a challenge for your organizations that are trying to focus on improving just kind of global relations, global economics. And I don't have the answer to that, but I see that as live it every day when I walk out the door here in St. Louis.
No, I mean, I think you're right on point. You know, you start looking at the statistics. I think of the top 10 universities in the United States for foreign students, particularly Chinese students, Asian students, 6 of those top 10 come out of our Heartland region. You know, the perception is that these students from other countries in China come to the East Coast and the West Coast. In fact, the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana is one of the leaders, maybe 2 or 3 at the top. And you just go down the list. So many of these institutions have done a very good job. I sometimes fault, I think, our own communities because we don't take enough advantage of getting to know these foreign students, knowing their families and their backgrounds, and trying to connect our businesses in our heartland with the businesses of that family that comes from a foreign country. And I think there's a lot of things that we could do in that regard that could really benefit both parties. And I think both countries, both cultures have to work with each other for mutual success. Then I think we can find a lot more common ground than unfortunately what sometimes we're seeing today. So,
Hey, Governor, if I could interject, I totally agree. And I sit on the board of St. Olaf College, my alma mater in Minnesota. And we're about to open up under these COVID times next month. And we have a large portion of our foreign students that go to a little St. Olaf College in southern Minnesota. They can't go because they can't get visas at this point in time for various reasons. And this is just a small microcosm of another challenge I think the Heartland will be facing this coming fall.
Yeah, to both of you, what in your mind, what has gone wrong with our foreign policy engagement from 1945 to 2020? I mean, where did we get off the rail in your mind, and how do we get back on the rail?
I'll let Liz take that one first.
Thanks a lot. I actually think it's exactly what Ward just said. I think we stopped listening and we assumed the elites, and I'll put ourselves right in there, you know, stopped listening to understand that there was a whole group of Americans that we weren't communicating to about why it was important to engage in the world. There's a congresswoman, a freshman congresswoman from Michigan, and in the Heartland, and she's a national security. She's in a very purple district, and she's a national security expert. And she said, and she's got a lot of she has some college students, but she also has a lot of less educated, that Ward, the kind of demographic you were talking about. And she said, no one asked her about foreign policy. The fact that she had a national security background gave her some credibility, particularly as a woman. But nobody wanted to talk to her about foreign policy. And what she realized is we needed to sell to young people, particularly, about why we needed to be engaged in the world. They didn't care about the Marshall Plan. They didn't care about all the things that we're talking about today. We had to resell the why, the return on investment. And I think, Governor, we probably missed the boat of talking to ourselves, talking to missed the boat of explaining the why. And I take, certain responsibility in that. So why are we in the Heartland? To go, and we're going to do a Southern initiative too, is to go back and explain the why and build those connections.
Yeah, we're starting to get, in fact, we've gotten several questions already from the audience, and one of them, Liz, touches right on to your point, and I'd like Ward to mention it too. Why would we care about sending foreign aid in money and goods to other countries when there is so much need in our own country? So how do we respond to that? Ward, from your standpoint?
From my standpoint, it's a little bit of my self-image of our country's history and being certainly since World War II, philanthropic on top as a value. But from an economics, it makes perfect sense in terms of priming the pump, so to speak, for future consumers and future markets that we can trade with. So not only maybe is it the ethical thing to do, but it actually can, to Liz's point, have a long-term return on investment. One way of that I've seen in the past of referencing this is spheres of influence. And you can literally take the globe and mark up, where is the US or kind of dominant, where would a Russia or China be dominant? And then there's huge areas open for grabs, up for grabs, think of in a marketing term, and whose sphere of influence is strongest. Again, think of Latin America, maybe. That used to be a US sphere of influence, maybe still is. Africa was always kind of viewed, most of Africa was viewed as kind of wide open. And so to do the right thing ethically in terms of helping countries, whether it's from a health point of view, education point of view, systems point of view, democracy point of view, but also from an economic point of view, this is priming the pump for future consumers of and people embracing US culture versus alternative models. I think also the Chinese and the Russians, for that matter, and India and the lower small kind of can view it the same way. So either we as a people, as a democracy, choose to play in that, or we choose to just focus on within our borders. And that's what has ebbed and flowed over time. We're in more of the America-only mode right now. I think it costs us. It costs us allies. It costs us markets. It costs us economic opportunity. It hurts our image worldwide. None of those are good. So, I think we can get back onto that based on our inherent strengths as a country, but you have to have the leadership to do it.
Yeah. Ben, real quick, where are we on time? I don't want to run over here.
Chairman Holden, we're ready for maybe the last question, call to action, comments.
Well, thank you. My timing was pretty good. I appreciate that. I mean, to me, the key question for both of you is, we know where we've been, we know where we are, how do we go forward to reinsert ourselves globally and be a partner around the world? And Liz, I'll give you the first opportunity at that, and then Ward can have his shot at it too.
So here's where I'm going to focus on is two things. Is we have to bring some bipartisanship back, and I'm going to focus on next generation. As we were talking about before the program started, is foreign policy has always been the one place where, as a great senator from the Midwest once said, that politics stopped at the water's edge, and that has been broken, and we need to bring that back. And so I am a bipartisan person at heart. I always will be, and I'm not going to stop now. So we have brought together people from the Freedom Caucus to the Progressive Caucus on global hunger to fighting global poverty, and we need to have America being a force for good. And as Ward said, it is in our interest, and don't ever let anybody forget that's why we give foreign aid. It is not charity, it's in our interest. So I'm going to fight for bipartisan. And the second thing is, what is the call to action? I am going to have the greatest joy in my life at the end of the year or at the beginning of January, which is I'm going to become a grandma. And and so I am very attuned to the next generation. So we've got to fix this thing, and I'm going to put all my cards on the next generation. We are launching a next generation initiative, not quite as young as my grandchild, but 25 to 35-year-olds that we want every state that we work in to anoint two individuals, someone who leans a little left and somebody who leans a little right, and that we're going to invest in them because we want to empower the next generation. And that's how I think we are going to fix the woes of the world, is to make sure their voices rise up, and we better listen to them.
Along those lines, and Ward, how do we get young people more active in our organizations and what we're doing? How do we get more involvement with the African American community, the Hispanic community, the females and the males. How do we take our culture and bring it together to really be a force throughout the world? And I'm kind of leave that for both of you to finish your last comments in our program. So Ward, give us the answer.
You know, obviously that's another hour and we don't have it. I agree with Liz's comment, bipartisan leadership is necessary to move us forward, and I look forward to that. And from the young people point of view, it's a combination of both our educational institutions, public in particular, as well as the media and communicating the importance of international relations to this next generation.
Liz?
I think we cannot be successful unless we have diverse voices, we look like America, we engage America, and they have to be excited about America's role in the world. The most interesting thing is they already are. They don't see borders the way, frankly, I saw borders as a kid. I didn't travel as a young person. Getting on a plane was the most exciting thing I did when I was 10 years old and went from Chicago to Detroit, and that was a big thing. It was so, kids get on the internet in a way we didn't do that. So we have to inspire that excitement about the why. It goes back to the why. And so it is a whole different language and a whole different conversation. But if we don't figure it out, the three of us are probably not the right demographic and not the right in multiple ways to be even leading this conversation. And that's one of the things we're really trying to think about. I'm sure, Governor, you are as well, is how do we diversify our leadership in who's at the leadership and what age we engage in. So we are dramatically looking at those very, very questions of who's participating and how do we engage a more diverse voice.
Well, we couldn't have had a better couple of people to discuss all of these issues than Ward, you and Liz. I really appreciate it. And I think it's very important for all of our leaders, irrespective of the political parties and their philosophy, that we do a better job of reaching out to all elements of our culture. We reach out to all elements and cultures around the world to say, we welcome you to participate. Let's figure out a way to make this work for all parties involved. And if everybody's got something invested in success, then they won't try to destroy it. And that's, you two are truly our leaders in that type of agenda and approach. Any final comments, Ward, you want to make on our
Just
program?
a quick thank you for allowing me to participate. It was a pleasure, Liz, to get to know you and hear you. And Min and Governor Holden, thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Liz?
Hear, hear. Governor, hats off to you for your continued leadership in U.S. Heartland China Association. To Min, Ward, you're extraordinary. I learned a lot from you today. And to all those participating, stay engaged. We need you.
Well, I thank you. And for someone that started out in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Missouri, without people along the way, people in both parties opening doors for me, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do the things that I've done in life. And I think it's our responsibility, all of us, and I'm really talking to our audience here, that we need to think about how we can do more to help build the relationships going forward that we've had in the past. And so to you two and to our audience, I say thank you very, very much for your participation and your involvement. And let's make sure we make it happen.